it's a country of contrasts. Obviously, we've heard a lot, you tend to hear a lot about the plight of women. Women often forced to wear burqas to cover up. They don't have anything like equal rights as men, certainly not under law. And yet, that doesn't mean they're completely closed off from us. Indeed, on one of my first ever evenings in Kabul, I was taken by a friend of mine to have supper with her former bodyguard. She'd been a journalist there when, during the US-led invasion in 2001, and she befriended a warlord, and this warlord had given her a bodyguard. And we arrived in these Russian-built flats, and this man greeted us at the door, and he showed us in. And his wife was there, but she very quickly sort of scurried off into the kitchen. She was cooking the food. We went and sat down. She came in, she presented the food, and then she'd leave very quickly. She didn't join us, and this seemed normal. And then after supper, she came back into the room. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of what I'm about to tell you, but she sat down in front of us and she started breastfeeding her child right in front of me. So from that point on, I think that was an important early lesson that any prejudice, any preconceived ideas I might have had about Afghanistan simply would never hold up. It's a country full of pretty mean-looking dudes. I'm sure you've seen and heard stuff about the war, about the Taliban. But it's also a country where these mean-looking dudes like nothing more than to decorate their horses with flowers. They like nothing more than swan lilacs on their legs. People are incredibly hospitable. This is one of the things you'll often hear. In my time there, I made some fantastic friends, and yet the national sport is incredibly violent. They like to wrestle for the carcass of a headless, hoofless and disemboweled goat or calf like this, and effectively play rugby on horseback with this body. They like fighting almost anything that can be made to fight. Although dogfighting, I should say, is not as savage as you think, because they don't really fight them to the death as they do in Europe. That's principally because the dogs are too expensive. They fight them until first blood. They fight camels. It's quite a spectacle. They tend to feed them marijuana or some sort of drug in order to get them aggressive and going. And they're also just generally quite warlike people. And this might seem like a surprising picture to show you here, but this is Schwab, who was my translator. And he came on holiday to London during these riots, and you probably know more about these riots than I do, but we'd been in the London Aquarium, we were walking over the Thames, and I said to him, we've got a choice. I had a phone call, I knew the protests were happening down at Millbank. I said, we can either go and have a look at Piccadilly Circus, do the touristy thing, have a cup of coffee, get some souvenirs, or there's some protests down at Millbank. But I said, it might be a bit like work, covering a protest, we don't really want to do that. He's like, no, I want to go to the riots. There he was, and about 20 seconds after this picture was taken, he picked up an empty Coke bottle and lobbed it at the police. So I suspect he's never going to get another visa. Now, I talk a little bit about the journalism that I did. Afghanistan's quite a difficult country to get around, and this picture should give you some idea of why that is. Partly the difficulties in travelling around Afghanistan are to do with the terrain. Partly some of the difficulties are to do with the politics and obviously the people and who they support and who they think we support and who we represent. And so that leaves a number of options for us as journalists trying to get to the truth, trying to understand the country. And one of the most common options that many journalists take is they embed with the military. Now this has many advantages. You go and live with the soldiers, you get to fly in helicopters. I can't overstate how much fun it is to fly in helicopters. They're always cool. The downside is you have to wear ridiculously heavy and uncomfortable body armour. You have to traipse through often flooded fields and irrigation ditches. You have to live in some discomfort, and ultimately people shoot at you. That's what's happening here. Now that is part of the reason we do it, because that's part of the story that we want to cover. But it entails clearly a certain amount of risk. The advantage is, of course, that you're with these soldiers and they usually know what they're doing. Although what I should say about this picture is that one of the soldiers, moments before this was taken, had said, "Don't worry, it's miles away." We'd heard a few shots, and then about 10 seconds after that, the earth around his feet erupted. I was lying in a tractor trench, and that's a tyre. That's not much cover at all, and suddenly realised that in fact the people around me were not really the most experienced soldiers. I had the media handler, we had the dog handler, and we had a sergeant major who was a TA sergeant major on secondment to the army. So suddenly I felt pretty scared, and we were running pretty fast. Of course, the other thing is that things do go bang. The biggest killer of British and NATO soldiers in Afghanistan, is IEDs. Improvised explosive devices, and particularly in Helmand and Kandahar, where most of the British soldiers are, they are everywhere. They're incredibly cheap to produce, incredibly easy to make and to dig into the ground, and very difficult to detect. And this has, the consequences are pretty grim. I'm sure you've read about it, but this is what it looks like when an American soldier, this is an American soldier, when American soldiers are wounded and killed. Embedding also presents a number of problems for us, because this picture was taken in Helmand. This is actually with the British soldiers. Now, in order for us to travel with the Brits, we have to sign all sorts of complicated contracts, or sign away all sorts of rights as journalists. Principally, the British military insists that if we're going to live with them and travel with them, they get to read our stories before we print them. Now, this picture, we're actually in a 50-metre square area on a mound in Helmand, which had been cleared by a team of a high assurance search team, so the best bomb detectors that we've got, because they were planning on building a base there, so they needed to be double sure that there was nothing there. And we spent the night, there was no cover, but we were out in the desert, so we're quite a long way from everything, certainly beyond the range of rifle fire. And it was about 50 metres by 50 metres. They marked it out with little glow sticks and spray paint on the ground, so we knew, at least we thought we knew, where it was safe to walk. And I was sitting in the shade of one of these vehicles just out of shot to the left, waiting. They found a bomb, they were going to do a controlled detonation. I was waiting for it to go off when suddenly a soldier, a man called Corporal David Barnsdale, was walking towards me, and he stepped on a bomb that they hadn't found. And suddenly, it's quite hard to explain, but literally it felt as though the whole world had gone white. There was a huge explosion. My first thought was that perhaps we were being mortared. As I say, because we were out of range of rifle fire. Something that had clearly gone wrong. And we thought we were in a safe area. It was only afterwards they realised that in fact they hadn't managed to detect this bomb, and that was principally because the battery pack, which is the only bit of metal, was somewhere else. It was about 2 metres away, beyond where they'd searched, and then there were wires running into our safe area, and then there was a small pressure plate, and underneath the pressure plate was a yellow plastic tub full of explosives, full of homemade explosives, fertiliser bomb, very easy to make. And unfortunately Corporal Barnsdale was killed instantly, and this is his friends in the moment afterwards grieving his loss. This is clearly one of the most difficult moments for us to report, very delicate situation for us to be in. Often soldiers don't want you there when something like this happens, but also with hindsight, and often some of the more mature soldiers realise they really do want you there. It tends to polarise opinion. Some of them are upset, they've just lost their friend. Others of them are still upset, just lost their friend, but they realise it's important that people like you should know what's happening in Afghanistan and in anywhere indeed where they are fighting and dying. But I mentioned before that embedding does have these problems, and one of the problems is that we have to let the military, from a journalist point of view, we have to let the military see our stories before they file. And this ostensibly is so that we don't say anything that's going to endanger soldiers. So we don't say there's an attack tomorrow morning and they're going to attack this location, and then the Taliban read it and they're all ready and they've defended the place. But in fact, unfortunately, it is increasingly used by the military to censor, to effectively try and stop bad news getting out and to encourage good news to get out. And this has led to a situation where, when I reported this story, after the soldier had died, after his family had been informed, I was kicked off the embed process by the British military. Now, this sort of creates a very difficult situation for our newspaper and the military, and it's also created a situation where other newspapers, particularly American newspapers, won't even travel with British troops because they think the censorship rules are too strict. And so we find ourselves in a very difficult situation where British soldiers are doing fantastic work, they're doing a very difficult job, but the relationship between the media and the military is at risk of breaking down to an extent where people won't find out what's happening because journalists won't travel with them. At the other extreme, you'll find actually the military will go to great lengths to cover up the truth. Now this, I don't say that lightly, and every time I discover the military have lied, I remain a little bit shocked. I think I like to believe that it is always a noble organisation, and I think in 99% of the time it is. This man is called Haji Sharabuddin, and he's counting on his hand there the number of his family who'd been killed in a US Special Forces night raid. And what happened, you can see the graves here, what happened is one of his sons was a policeman, another one was a prosecutor working for the Afghan government, and they lived in a place called Khataba in Gardez, which is in southeastern Afghanistan. And what happened was that the Americans had had faulty intelligence, they had launched an operation, and they had surrounded his house. At the time, they just had a newborn baby, and it's traditionally in Afghanistan, it's a bit like a christening. On the 6th night of a child's life, you have a party, you invite all your friends, all your neighbours, and the grandparents announce the new child's name, and that's what they were doing. And they had music and they had dancing. These were people who worked for the government, and so all these things, music particularly, which the Taliban would have banned, were in full flow. I'm not sure there was any alcohol, but the music and the party was in full flow when the special forces arrived, speaking with Pashtun accents, speaking with Kandahari accents. That's significant because it's accents that were from a different part of the country. And so this man, one of Haji Sharabuddin's sons, who was the policeman, was concerned. He was a policeman. He thought maybe the Taliban were coming to get him because he was working for the government. In fact, they were the local Afghan special forces who were working with the Americans. To cut a fairly long story short, what happened is the special forces got onto the roof, they opened a fire, they killed the policeman, they killed another man, and in the process of killing the second man, the bullets went through his body and killed 3 women who were standing in the doorway behind him. 2 of them were pregnant, and one of them was engaged to be married. Now, the first we heard of this was when the military put out a press release the following day and said they had killed 2 armed insurgents. And they said when they searched the compound, they had found the bodies of 3 women who had been tied up, gagged, and killed. The clear implication from the American military was that the 2 armed insurgents who they'd neutralised, which is their word for it, had been responsible for some sort of macabre honour killing. And it went, that was it, that was the final word. As it happened, the following day, there was a huge US operation in Helmand, in Marja. Some of you may have heard of it, Operation Moshtarak. It was supposed to be the moment, one of the turning points in the war, and most of the international media was focused on that. Nobody was looking at Gardez. It's really only by chance that we managed to go down there a few weeks later and speak to everybody involved, to speak to the family, to speak to the local mullahs who'd been involved in washing the bodies, to speak to guests at the party who told us what had really happened. And it was then only after that that this man, Vice Admiral McRaven, who was the commander of the American Special Forces, went down to meet Haji Sharabuddin on the right and to apologise. And interestingly, the way he did that was he took a sheep to their door, and they offered to sacrifice the sheep at this man's door to beg for forgiveness. It's an ancient Pashtun ritual in Afghanistan. And so that's McRaven there, you may have heard of him. He's since been promoted. He was the man who oversaw the Joint Special Operations Command. They were the people who killed bin Laden about a year and a half after this was taken. Now, there are other ways of getting around Afghanistan. embedding has its limits. This was my favourite way. This was my Beetle when I lived in Kabul. That's Shuaib, the same man you saw rioting in London. And that behind them is the Darul Palace, which was built in the 1920s during one of the periods of modernisation when Afghanistan looked like it had fantastic prospects. There was a modernising king, Russia was pouring money in from the north, the Americans were beginning, the French were pouring archaeologists in, the Brits still weren't very welcome because we just lost the Third Anglo-Afghan War, but anyway, things were looking good for Afghanistan. Sadly though, you can see things didn't work out for that palace. Lots of ways, other than travelling with the military, of getting around Afghanistan. Horseback, one of my favourites again. You can see they're fond of their bright colours on the horses. Motorbikes, fantastic way of travelling around. I was very lucky. I did get to go on a lot of long motorbike trips around Afghanistan. And the reason I say that is because it's travelling like this that you really manage to sort of get under the skin of the country, and you manage to meet lots of people. Now, having spent hours on these motorbikes and eaten an awful lot of dust, it's not something I'm in a huge hurry to do again. But it creates opportunities like this to go swimming in the Banyamir Lake. Opportunities that I'm sure you can well imagine are lost to you when you're travelling in these vast armoured cars, which unfortunately is the way our military are forced to operate for good reasons. But it means that the military do have a very different perception of Afghanistan to those of us who've lived there as civilians. This is the Festival of Ashura, something that happens in Kabul. I'm just using these as examples of the things we get to go and see, the things we get to go and visit. These are Shia Muslims. I'm sure most of you in Arabists know more about this than I do, but they're protesting the death of their imam. His name has escaped me. Ali, yeah, thank you, Ali. This is an Afghan mental asylum. This is again something we can only get to see by travelling independently and doing what we do. This chap, clearly not looking very happy. He's been chained up to a post. He's being fed bread and chilies for 30 days. And if you were to turn around, unfortunately I don't have the photograph of it here, but there was a shrine, and this was sort of tied into a sort of slightly loose Afghan interpretation of Islam. The mullah there assured us that the shrine had managed to cure every mentally ill patient they'd ever had on a diet of bread and chilies. This is the aftermath of an attack on the American embassy. These are some of those mean-looking dudes, but actually not so mean when you let them sit on your motorbike, having a little play. These are just examples. This is a newly refurbished courtyard in Kabul, and this is the old Russian cultural centre, which was built as a showpiece of the Soviet occupation, which has since become this sort of symbol of imperial hubris, really, completely bombed, hollow, and bullet scarred in the civil war that engulfed Afghanistan when the Russians left. It was on one of those motorbike trips that I managed to meet this lady who's called Zara. Afghanistan's one of the countries that still hasn't managed to eliminate leprosy. You may notice from her fingers that she's suffering from advanced stage leprosy. It's not contagious. I had my sort of Princess Diana moment when I met her, because having been assured by the World Health Organization that it wasn't contagious, actually what she really craved was human contact, and so really somebody just shaking her hand and putting an arm over her shoulder was a huge solace to her. And I visited her twice, and the real tragedy was that I visited her 8 months apart, 10 months apart, I think. And on the second occasion, her and her carers revealed that we were the only people who had visited her in that time. Because for people who don't understand leprosy, and indeed I was one of them before I met her, and people who think this disease is still contagious, and it can be contagious, but as soon as it's medicated, it becomes safe. They're terrified, and they believe it's a curse from God, and therefore they don't want to have anything to do with her. And she had one other companion, and that was it. The two of them, and one chap looking after them, who's paid by a Scandinavian charity. It was on a motorbike trip that I met this man in the middle, whose name originally was Sergei, but is now known as Nur Muhammad. This is a very unusual phenomenon. You may notice he doesn't have the eyes of an ordinary Afghan. That's because this man was a Russian conscript soldier. And you may have heard the Russian conscript soldiers were, some of them, treated incredibly badly by their own army. Very bad pay, very bad conditions, very brutal hazing rituals within the army. And this man confessed with a fairly wry smile that when he was in the army he used to steal military supplies with his comrades, and they used to sell them in the local bazaar, and they used to use the money that they got from selling their supplies, their food, possibly even their ammunition, although he wouldn't be drawn on it, to supplement their own income so that they could live slightly better. And he was in a place called Chagtra, which is one of the armpits. There are many contenders, but it's one of the armpits of Afghanistan. And he ran away. He got caught, and he knew that he was going to get court-martialed and be in a whole world of pain. And so he ran away. He literally ran off the base and ran into the hills. He was effectively adopted by the Mujahideen. He learned Dari, one of the local languages. He converted to Islam, and he's been living in this town, working as a mechanic ever since. Now, these people, in many ways, these Afghan policemen, represent NATO's strategy, if such a thing exists. They represent what we're trying to do, building up the Afghan forces so that we can leave and so that Afghanistan can move forward with its own security forces capable of maintaining security inside Afghanistan. You may have heard stories, the Afghan police and indeed the soldiers, but particularly the police, are notoriously corrupt. I'm sure some of you have travelled, I'm sure many of you have travelled around the third world, the developing world, and I'm sure some of you have encountered corruption. When I was living in Kabul, we didn't have any security on our house. We had some barbed wire and a high fence, but even I could climb it when I lost my keys. But we did have a doorman. A doorman is called a chowkidor. Looks after the house, effectively maintains the house, but ostensibly his primary job is to open and shut the doors. They sound incredibly colonial, but I promise you it's normal. Anyway, one day he didn't turn up to work, and I spoke to one of his cousins the second day. I said, where's Tahir? And they tried to tell me the story. He was in hospital. His wife was giving birth. It was complicated. She was in hospital. Now, I knew that when women give birth, husbands don't go to hospital in Afghanistan. So that didn't wash. They were covering for him. There was something up, and they wouldn't tell me. Turned out, after about 3 days, he'd been arrested. They were worried that if we found out that he'd been arrested, we'd fire him. He'd been arrested for kidnapping. So I was slightly concerned. There were a few kidnappings happening in Kabul at the time, so I asked who he'd been accused of kidnapping. He'd been accused of kidnapping his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law was presented at the house about 20 minutes later. His brother-in-law clearly hadn't been kidnapped. Now, we went to the police station, and unfortunately, because they hadn't told us about this immediately, he'd been moved from one police station to another police station to another police station. He was now in Kabul provincial centre of Walayat, the main police station, not the main prison, but the main police station, West End Central, in the drunk tank, but not for drunks. Anyway, we eventually managed to speak to the prosecutor, who said, and I said, look, I've got the man he's accused of kidnapping. Surely you can realise you have no case, you can release him. Ah, yes. But we need to process the paperwork. We'll need to process the paperwork to get him out. I asked, how long is that going to take? And he sort of looked at me and he went through the files and sort of ummed and ahed, cooed. He spoke a little bit. I was with a translator, they spoke a little bit good. But you see, first of all, we need to process that he'd been in prison 3 days by now. So first of all, we need to process the paperwork to process him into the prison, and then we can process the paperwork to process him out. And what they were really trying to say, and as I discovered later, it was going to cost me $400. And that's what it was. It was $400 to get a man who earns about $250 a month, $400 to get him out of prison. Now, this is one of the problems that really is a cancer right throughout almost every organisation, every institution in Afghanistan is riddled with this type of corruption. This was one of the few times I had to spend that much on it, but on a day-to-day basis it's not unusual to have to pay bribes to get anything done, to get your electricity bill brought down so that you're not being charged some extortionate rate per unit per unit, and the electricity is not on very often. That said, and this goes back to some of the complexity and the complexity of Afghanistan and the people, is that for all of those things, for all of these problems, they are suffering enormously, and they're doing what they can, they're doing their best to cope in these conditions. They're particularly difficult conditions. They've got a foreign army living in their country, they've got a government which is corrupt, and they've got an insurgency which is pretty indiscriminate, not to mention large elements of criminality. Now, the next few pictures are fairly graphic. These were from the Ashura. There was a bomb at Ashura, so this was just a few months ago, in which more than 100 people, they think now, were killed. Most of them were children. They were queuing to go through this door, through that white gate. Most of them were huddled in family groups. The suicide bomber, a Pakistani organisation, claimed responsibility, although neither the police nor NATO were confident of that claim. They're not sure who was behind it. They're not sure if it was a sectarian attack. One of the things that is one of the few saving graces of the violence in Afghanistan is that it's not normally sectarian. Most of the people who died in this attack were Shia Muslims. Most of the people who perpetrate the attacks in Afghanistan are Sunni Muslims. Now, in Iraq, this was a central element of the violence. In Afghanistan, it hasn't been so far. This represents a potentially very worrying development. It may also have just been a target of opportunity. This is something that may emerge over the next few weeks, months and years. There haven't been any more sectarian attacks to date. But I show you this really as an example of how ordinary people really are suffering on a day-to-day basis, with, in many cases, with extraordinary dignity. I think you can see in the middle there the scorch marks from where the bomb went off, and most of the victims scattered around in a circle. That's not all bad. This is a family I met whilst travelling independently, which I hope I've made that point earlier. By far the best way of travelling, to my mind anyway, as a journalist. I was in Lashkar in 2009 for the elections, for the presidential elections. You may remember President Hamid Karzai was re-elected with 1 million fraudulent votes, but still re-elected. And this boy on the right was then 15 years old, and he was cycling. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. He was too young to vote, but that didn't really make any difference to anybody. He was cycling to the polling station, and he was balanced on the back of a bicycle, and also he was pedalling a bicycle. His brother was balanced on the back, and they were about 60 metres from the polling station. It was very early in the morning. They probably would have been the first people to vote, and a rocket came in from over the river and landed about 2 or 3 metres away from them, erupting in the tarmac. Najib, both of them were knocked off the bicycle. Hamid, his brother, who was behind him, was decapitated by a piece of shrapnel. Najib suffered a piece of metal in his left eye and a bit of metal in his left foot, and was temporarily unconscious. And this example of where the military has been a huge help, because I said I was travelling independently, and I was, and we couldn't do anything to help Najib that day. He was taken to, his brother was dead, he was taken to the local Afghan emergency hospital. They patched him up, they did what they could. but they couldn't get the metal out of his eye. And I don't know much about eye injuries, but I've since discovered that you need to treat them really quickly. Time is everything, and you need pretty advanced kit to be able to do it. And so, with pulling a few strings, the Brits agreed that they would. He came up to Kabul, and the Brits agreed that they would take him into their hospital, which is actually a French hospital, but the Brits took him into the NATO hospital. And the French surgeon here on the right, and you can see, I think, in the top left corner, that's what he's doing with his hands. It looks pretty gory to me, but anyway, doing his best to get the metal out. And I share this story with you because it's one of the most hopeful things that I think has happened while I've been there. This is Najib in the Natural History Museum in London. He had a very long journey. He went to America. They operated on him in Kabul. He went to America. They operated on him again there. Unfortunately, they couldn't save the eye, so his left eye is no longer operational. But through this travel, this cobbler's son, his father mends shoes for about $1 or $2 a day, polishes shoes, in the bazaar in Lashkar. Lashkar is another contender for the armpit of Afghanistan. I told you there were many. He'd lost his brother. He discovered an insatiable appetite for learning English, a huge enthusiasm for travelling and meeting new people, and a huge enthusiasm just for learning in general. He's determined at the moment to try and be a doctor. Fortunately, we were able to get him, he managed to win himself a scholarship to a school in Buckinghamshire, my old school. So that's him, dressed up, almost wearing a school uniform on his first evening, and that's him meeting the headmaster. There are people like Najib. There are dozens of people, hundreds, thousands of people like Najib. I mean, the number of civilians who are being killed every single day is staggering. I mean, it's almost 10 people a day, civilians are being killed in Afghanistan every single day on average. That doesn't include, that's people like Najib's brother. People like Najib, the people who are injured, those numbers aren't really recorded. And yet the people like Najib who get to come to England, the people like Najib who get these opportunities are far, far fewer. It's quite a roundabout way, I think, that I'm trying to make the point, which is that there is an extraordinary amount of suffering going on in Afghanistan, going on in many places, and this suffering is not necessarily caused by us or caused by any particular group at any one time, although clearly this is exacerbated massively by the conflict. The conflict, and perhaps is something we can talk about in questions, is being exacerbated for any number of reasons. It's being exacerbated because in Pakistan they're terrified that India is trying to make Pakistan an ally in order to get strategic depth. They're worried that the Indians are going to make Pakistan their country. They're worried that therefore the Pakistanis have effectively, and I don't think it's too strong to say this, they've been fighting a proxy war against British and NATO forces for much of the last 10 years through the Taliban. The Taliban are their proxies. There are all sorts of theories about American interest and what British and NATO interest is in Afghanistan. I would argue to you that actually, whilst our politicians have told us that the reason we're there is to make ourselves safer here, that might have been the motive from about 2002 to 2005. Initially, we went there for revenge. There's no two ways about that. This was revenge for the World Trade Center attacks. Then it became about keeping us safe. I mean, it's really up for you to decide whether or not you think that we're still being made safer by having British and NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. Certainly, people like Najib, I should point out, would tell you that although he's uncomfortable with foreign forces in his country, he's also very anxious about what will happen when they leave. We've said that we're leaving Afghanistan militarily we said we're going to cease combat operations by 2014. The truth is that most troop contributing nations, particularly the Americans, particularly the British, they've got their eye on the exit now. They've set a date. They've just very recently brought the date forward when they're going to try and stop fighting and hand over. The Afghan forces are going to struggle in their place. There's no two ways about that. It'll be very clear. I'm pretty bleak on what the future does hold for Afghanistan, and that's why I want to show you these guys. More mean-looking dudes. This is in Gore province, which is in the centre of the country. It's to the north of Helmand, if that's your point of reference. It's to the west of Bamiyan, to the west of Kabul, right in the middle in the Central Highlands. There are, in Gore province, 160 Lithuanian soldiers. It's one of the largest provinces in Afghanistan. To give you some comparison, in Helmand province, which is about the same size, slightly bigger, there are 30,000 NATO soldiers, 10,000 Brits, 20,000 Americans, and about 10,000 Afghan soldiers. So in all, maybe 40,000 soldiers. In Gore, 160 Lithuanians. So there's no way they can cover the whole country, the whole province. And now when combat forces withdraw, whatever shape that withdrawal takes over the next few years, we may leave behind some special forces, we may leave behind some garrisons and training capacity, but the chances are, to my mind anyway, that Afghanistan is going to start to resemble Gore province, another contender for the armpit. And what's happening there is that men like these guys, who are part of tribal militias, effectively, they are the law. Now we met them, and that first photograph was just as we sort of entered their territory. We come out with a police escort. They'd met us. You can see they're all armed with AK-47s. The chap in the middle distance in the white helmet, he's actually taken over from me as the Times correspondent now in Kabul. And these guys, hospitable, as I mentioned before, hospitable to a fault. They're escorting us for our own safety, but also for their prestige, into their territory. And this is what we wanted to see. It was the minaret of Jam. It's this second tallest mud minaret in the world, built by the Ghaznavids, in about 1100 years ago, I think. It's embarrassing, I should know that properly. It was this monument which the Right Honourable MP Rory Stewart, who some of you may have heard of, walked to on his walk across Afghanistan. Some people suspect that it may once have been a sort of ancient capital city, home of a turquoise mountain. But anyway, this minaret is almost the edge of that militia's territory. Any car that wants to pass through their territory gets taxed. Passenger car, I think, gets taxed about $1. If it's a sort of saloon car, a Toyota Corolla, most of the saloon cars in Afghanistan are Toyota Corollas. A people carrier gets taxed about $4, $5, and a heavy goods vehicle with cargo gets taxed about $10. Now, this is an imperfect situation. It was a situation like this. It was a proliferation of militias like this in southern Afghanistan in the 1990s, which enraged people so much that when the Taliban finally emerged, they were welcomed, they were cheered, they were clapped into the streets of Kabul. Because these militias answer only really to themselves. They can charge what they like. And in the past they have committed, certainly, horrific human rights abuses. They murder people, they rape people, they rob people, and they fight with the rival militias. It's not unlike England might have been, and I'm talking to history students, so I won't try and put a date on it, but I'm fairly certain that feudal England, certainly before the Act of Livery, and you can correct me, but certainly before private armies were broken, it's not unlike how England might have been. We live in a country where we take the rule of law for granted. I wouldn't necessarily think twice about getting in a car and driving back to London tonight, even though it's after dark. I wouldn't mind getting a train on my own. Travelling isn't really dangerous for us, apart from the risk of having a crash. Travelling in a country like Afghanistan, when you move away from these centres of power, is very dangerous. And it's because of bandits, it's because of militias, and it's because of insurgents. I suspect that when we leave Afghanistan, you'll see more men like these people in control. That looks like he's pointing the gun at me, but I think it's just, I hope it was just a lucky frame, and in fact he was just slinging it off his shoulder. Now, I've talked a lot about the serious stuff in Afghanistan. You might wonder why I wanted to spend 5 years in this country of bandits, this country of carnage, even if it is this country of beautiful scenery, and it's because, to me, it was a paradise. There's a fantastic nightlife in Kabul. That might surprise you. And maybe I've been there so long that I've forgotten that I'm not the best measure of a fantastic nightlife. I was never so lucky to come to Exeter University. I was at Newcastle, and I have to say, I don't think in all my time at Newcastle I ever saw so many students in a single lecture theatre. So I'm very impressed. This is one of the nightclubs. There are actually about 4 or 5. Kabul is this extraordinary city. It's full of mercenaries, misfits, journalists, runaways. I often compare it to Neverland. It's often full of people who are running away from something, people who don't really want to grow up, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is one of these inside that club. This is a house party in Kabul. The man on the left, who's looking at the camera, is currently in, or has just got back from Homs. He's part of the BBC security team. He was the man. I don't know if any of you were watching that coverage, but he was the security advisor. They refer to him as a medic in many of their dispatches, who was having to climb onto roofs to try and hold up their satellite dish so that they could fire whilst under mortar fire in Homs. Beetles have many benefits, and if you're living in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, one of those benefits is smuggling alcohol under the bonnet, because the policemen don't know to look there. And also, I wanted to include a picture of my dog, that's Sherard, named after Sir Sherard Cooper-Coles, the former British ambassador. He's very proud of this. He refers to it in his book. He doesn't mention the reason we called Sherard Sherard, and that's because the dog is something of a leg humper. This is high fashion on the streets of Kabul. The man on the right is currently responsible for trying to negotiate a settlement with the Taliban. Formerly a Liberal Democrat. And this is a picture of my mum. And I tell you that because I think Kabul is safe enough for mothers to visit. I wouldn't have let her come if I didn't think it was safe. She did come. My sister's been twice. Friends of mine visited many times. It's one of these contrasts, and I'm not sure. I hope I've tried to make it clear, these kind of contrasts within Afghanistan. It's both a lot of fun and clearly quite dangerous. The danger sometimes adds to the fun, but perhaps if you imagine there was an insurgency in, the deepest, darkest Exeter, you'd probably be safe in London, and you'd almost certainly be safe in Glasgow. And that's a little bit how it is in Kabul. The violence does come into the capital. Obviously, those are surer pictures that I showed you. The violence comes right into the capital. But on the whole, it's contained in places like Kandahar, places like Helmand, these places which have become synonymous with casualties, really, since we've been fighting there. And I think the final picture I want to show you is this is what happens if you're not very good at smuggling the booze in your Beetle. You end up in prison. This is Kabul's notorious Pulichaki prison on the outskirts of Kabul. And again, one of these places that embodies many of these different complexities, that I've talked about. It's a very modern, relatively modern Soviet prison, massively overcrowded, full of Taliban and common criminals. The Taliban are radicalising the other criminals, leaving NATO and the government with huge concern. What do they do? How do they stop the radicalisation of inmates? But also, the grounds, we're led to believe, although they're refusing to dig them up at the moment, almost certainly full of mass graves from the 80s and 90s, when the various communist factions within the Afghan government, not really the Soviets, but communist factions within the Afghan government, were battling each other. And one of the things that amuses me is the line that you can see around this compound at the moment is a trench. And the reason they've done a trench is to stop people tunnelling in. And that's because in Kandahar, the Taliban literally dug a tunnel into the prison and managed to get 400 people free. I loved my time in Afghanistan. Absolutely loved it. I'm very sad to leave. A lot of people who left while I was there came back while I was there. It's the sort of country that has that effect on people. Clearly our commitment there is limited in terms of a British commitment. In a military sense, I think that's almost certainly a good thing. I think there's only so much we can achieve militarily. That said, it's going to need a lot of help for a very long time and in lots of different ways. And I hope maybe some of the people in this room tonight will go on to do things which will take them to Afghanistan. And so, on that note, if any of you have got any questions, now is probably a time to fire away. Yes?
How do I plan a trip to Afghanistan?
Good question. There are about 5 commercial flights every day. You need to.
Is it hard to get a visa?
You get a visa. You can get a visa from the London Embassy, or you can get a visa in Dubai. I fly to Dubai. There are 3 flights. It's easier to get a visa in Dubai. You need a letter of introduction, which essentially has to come from any kind of organisation, newspaper, charity. Effectively, if you set yourself up with your own headed notepaper or Exeter University headed notepaper, you can probably flag one. They're not really check very deeply. And then, as I said, 3 flights a day from Dubai, 3 commercial flights a day. Yep.
And you obviously saw some real sights out there. How do you, like the woman with leprosy and things like that, how do you go back to normal life and really distance yourself from it?
Good question. I've only been back 2 weeks, so if I start twitching, you'll realise that I'm not making that adjustment very well. I don't know, is the short answer. I don't know.
Why did you leave?
I've been there 5 years, and I really 5 years is quite a long time. Most soldiers do 6 months. Senior officers do a year. I personally am of the belief that that's far too short. I think if you want to understand a country, if you want to get to know a place like Afghanistan, then it's really worth doing much longer. I think the British political officers who did work with mixed results, admittedly, because we lost 15,000 people in one of our worst battles in Afghanistan, but British political officers who really did a much better job or a much more thorough job in the past, in the 1800s and early 1900s, would stay there for years. They'd learn the language, they'd take their families out there. My language, I got to a point with the language, but I'm not a gifted linguist. I think it was time to move on, but I hope I'll go back. I think I'll go back for the Civil War.
Could you just chart your career as a journalist up until your arrival in Afghanistan and sort of explain how you ended up going?
I worked for The Sun when I left university. They had a graduate training program. I spent quite a lot of time dressing up in fancy dress. They sent me dressed as a beef eater to deliver a joint of beef to Jacques Chirac the day before an Olympic announcement. They made me try and swim with sharks once because there were sharks off the corner, basking sharks off the coast of Cornwall. Part of that was fantastic. I also had to spend an awful lot of time sitting outside celebrity doorsteps. One of Jude Law's friends spat at me. That was a pretty low point. Sienna Miller's dad asked me why I was ruining people's lives. Didn't have a good answer. So I heard of a friend of mine who I'd always wanted to get into journalism. I thought I would be a travel writer. But then I don't know if you read travel writing in the newspapers anyway. I think a lot of it's pretty rubbish. So I decided that I didn't want to be a travel writer. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent and actually do news from foreign places. And I heard about a friend of a friend who was working in Afghanistan. And they were actually working for an organisation which did NATO propaganda. So this is my dark little secret, is that I did NATO's propaganda for 6 months, psychological operations. But it gave me a chance to get out there. I had a job, I was able to live in the city, got a taste for it, and then went out there and freelanced. And that was quite a daunting move to go out there as a freelancer, but I think it's probably one of the best moves I made, because if you're in a big organisation like a newspaper, any big organisation, it's very difficult to progress faster than the stream. And jobs, foreign postings, like Afghanistan, like any foreign posting, are often very sought after. But if you just go out there and do it, especially when there aren't that many people doing it, then newspapers, I discovered newspapers would buy my copy. So, and then, I'd like to say I've never looked back. I've looked back a couple of times, but I loved it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's the relationship from the young Afghanistan persons to alcohol in Kabul?
Yeah, good question. Most of them love it. It depends. Like in any society, you get people who are more devout, people who are less devout. Kabul, or the Kabul that's often referred to, it is far more secular than the rest of the country. However, even people from the deepest, darkest, most devout parts of Afghanistan, given an opportunity to get to Dubai, and some of them do, especially the wealthier ones, are pretty quick to take advantage of the sort of modern pleasures that Dubai offers. And that's true if they can get to Tajikistan. That's even true if they could, if they could come. Many of them would come to our house and drink beer with us, but they wouldn't. It's one of these things. If there were too many Afghans at the party, none of them would drink beer because they wouldn't want to be seen drinking beer in front of their friends. But there is a young and secular or more secular group of people emerging. But that said, even those people who drink beer would probably still be pretty appalled to hear that Qurans have been burnt, as you may have heard today, in an American base. So there is a shift. And to be honest, it's not just young people. I mean, if you meet any of the soldiers who served under the Russians, and a lot of the people in the armed forces, a lot of the people in the police served and trained under the Russians, they scoff at wine and beer. They tell you it's not alcohol, and they'll demand vodka.
When you were travelling around independently, how did you make sure that you were safe in doing that?
It's a really good question. You can't always be sure. There are certain parts of the country that's more safe than others. For example, on that trip to Gore, often some people say, never broadcast your movements, don't tell anyone where you're going. You can't trust the police, they're infiltrated, so don't tell anybody what you're doing. And often you deliberately try and sort of lie to people. You say that you get to a junction, you say we're going left, and you go right, or you say if you got stopped on the road, you'd only tell them that you're going to the next town, even if you were going to be driving the whole day. Actually, that can be counterproductive, because then you get overtaken by the policeman in a 4x4 and he realises you've lied to them and he's pissed off. On that trip to Gore, we actually did telegraph our movements. We rang the police chief, like we'd always ring the police chief one province ahead and say we're coming. One of them said, yeah, the road's absolutely fine, it's great, no problems at all. We got there and we went to go and see him. He said, thanks for your help, we're here. He goes, oh yeah, this Korean truck got hijacked yesterday. So why didn't you tell us? He goes, oh, because then you wouldn't have come. I mean, it's a bit of a gamble, but I mean, you have to remember that in these countries, ordinary people are going about their ordinary lives every day. Even in even in Kandahar, even in Jaray, Panjwai, the places where the fighting is at its worst, people do try and go about their ordinary lives. Eventually, places become abandoned, villages are abandoned and consigned to ruin. The airstrikes because of violence, but people try and go about their normal business. And so, if you can sort of get in with that flow of people, then that's the way to do it.
So Craig said you're off to Kenya next.
Yeah.
Do you think you're probably going across to like Somalia or something like that?
I suspect that's what my office wants to do. I plan on, setting myself up in a very comfortable house near a beach and as little as possible, but I suspect they will want me to go to Somalia, yeah.
How did you find the Afghani people reacted to you? You said they're very welcoming, but did you find they were hostile to you as a British journalist, or did they want you to sort of take their story and get it out to the world?
More often the latter. One of the sad things is that over the 5 years that I was there, the kind of mood changed. When I first arrived, and particularly what I was told of 2002, 2003, people really optimistic. The yoke of the Taliban had been lifted. There was a new opportunity for them. The whole world, that's what it felt like. The whole world had come to Afghanistan to try and help them rebuild. And then gradually those promises were broken. The rebuilding didn't really happen. And their stories were told, but then their stories were repeated. Civilians were killed, there was corruption in the government, Quran desecrated, incidents of torture, people dying in Bagram prison. So on a day-to-day basis, I found people were still surprisingly friendly. I'm not sure I would have been that friendly. I often try to imagine what it would have been like if I'd been driving down the M4 and a German convoy was coming on the wrong side of the road and I had to drive off the road to let them pass. And that's often the situation in Afghanistan because the Americans are so worried about bombs. If you see their convoy coming, you have to clear off the road to let them pass in case you're a suicide bomber. I feel pretty indignant about that. And some of them do. But actually, on the whole, people are really, really friendly and they did want their stories told, actually.
For the women in the audience, what do you think an experience would be like for a woman who did what you did whilst you're in Afghanistan? Whether it even be possible for them to do that, or whether it just there'll be so many limits that they wouldn't be able to go?
So it's a really good question. There are lots of female journalists out in Kabul and aid workers. They occupy a very strange space. It's like a third sex. They are not Afghan women. If you're an Afghan woman, often you wouldn't be allowed to work. You'd have to either wear a burqa or some sort of hijab or keep your hair veiled. Now, Western women, most of them do veil their hair. What they get is they get all the freedom of a foreigner, of a Western man, or all the freedom of an Afghan man, but all the access of an Afghan woman. So women can meet other women. They can travel into the female prison and speak to the prisoners. Most of Afghanistan's female prisoners have been jailed for being raped, because if you report a rape, that is considered sex out of wedlock. Women can cover all of those things. Now, one of the things you'll often hear is that men can't meet women. That's not true. I met this woman. I interviewed her unveiled for about an hour and a half. She decided she veiled up for the photograph because she knew that was going to be used, and that was more because she wanted to conceal her identity because she had fled a forced marriage and she didn't want her family to find her. So, but nonetheless, it was harder for me to do stories about women, and so I think the answer is you occupy this sort of strange space as a third sex, and it's good more people should do it.
This is linked in with the previous question actually, but what do you think of the prospects for human rights, and in particular for women in Afghanistan in the coming years?
Pretty bleak, to be honest. We've had the British NATO forces just had to suspend prisoner transfers from NATO custody. So if NATO forces arrest somebody, they used to transfer them to Afghan custody. They've had to suspend that recently because the Afghan intelligence agency and the Afghan police are basically fairly routinely torturing people. Justice is absolutely for sale. I told you about paying $400 to get this guy out of prison, and that is not unusual. In fact, it would be far more unusual if due process were followed without any bribes. If you're rich or powerful or well connected, then you have every kind of right you could possibly imagine. If you are poor or unresourced, then human rights are a pipe dream. Yeah.
How's the Ukraine rights going now?
Quite well. He's in his penultimate year. Although I think he's going to retake that. one of the things I found interesting and possibly alarming, and I'm not a teacher so I don't know, is that he was in the top 3 or top 5 of his class at one of the best state schools in Kabul. And he's come over to England. Obviously he's learning in a different language, so he's got an awful lot to take on board. But there is an awful lot to take on board, and I think possibly that gives us some indication of the education gap. We often hear politicians telling us there are 6 million new women in school, 6 million more women in school in Kabul now, or in Afghanistan now than there were before, X million number of boys. That's true, that's excellent, it's not to be scoffed at, it's a huge achievement. The real problem is that often their teachers had little or no education of their own, so they're usually only being taught the Quran, or only being taught very limited subjects, and that I think will present problems in terms of the country's development in the years to come, because there isn't this educated sort of middle class or super educated middle class that Afghanistan really needs to carry it forward.
Yeah. How is the relationship now between sort of the military and the civilians? Do they sort of understand, because you said that there are restrictions for security reasons on their travel, do they sort of understand Afghanistan in the same way as you did?
Between Afghan civilians and Afghan military, or?
Yeah, and the British forces.
The military have, I mean, if I'm honest, I say the military have been asked to do an almost impossible job in Afghanistan. We sent 3,000 British soldiers out to secure Helmand province, to rebuild, to sort of set up a political infrastructure, but really not quite from nothing, but without fully understanding either the scale of the threat or, importantly, the scale of the job in hand. Soldiers, British, American, German, most of the NATO coalition members, have got an inbuilt can-do attitude. You ask them to do something and be like, yes, I can find a way to do it. That's what they do, and they do it really well. The risk is if you give them an impossible job and they say, yes, I can do it, when actually that's not what they're designed to do, that's not what they're supposed to do, then you risk making matters worse. And there is certainly a growing school of thought, which is that what happened in 2006 is deliberately, knowingly or unknowingly, as we went in and we actually kicked a series of hornet's nests. We scattered our soldiers out across this province, which was never our plan. We were supposed to focus on Lashkar. And they strung themselves out across the province. And they did the only thing they knew how to do. They were paratroopers who are fantastic, aggressive soldiers. Very good at storming trenches, very good at killing people, very good at using aggression to achieve their end. That's what they're designed to do. I'm not going to fault them on that. And they have some very intelligent leaders, but actually what that ended up doing was we razed villages, we killed a lot of people, we made a lot of enemies. And possibly we're still reaping the whirlwind that was sown in 2006.
I wondered if you could tell us about your experience of the humanitarian work going on out there, and what form you think that should take once the troops leave.
Humanitarian work's been really curtailed by the military presence. I mean, there is work going on. What's happened is because there's been a phenomenon called the militarisation of aid, where soldiers, and this goes back to what I said before, not doing what they're necessarily best at doing. Soldiers trying to do aid, trying to do humanitarian work, which has made, because of that, in the eyes of the insurgents, humanitarian aid has become associated with the military. So the insurgents who don't support the military don't support humanitarian aid. In fact, the insurgents who attack the military also attack humanitarian aid workers. Now that's made life very difficult and dangerous for humanitarian aid workers. It means that a lot of places where they used to work they can't get to anymore. And so whilst there is good work being done, often by small charities, often by the organisations you don't hear of. I'm always very wary of the charities which you always hear of. And of course, I'm not knocking Oxfam, Save the Children, which do fantastic work, but there are organisations in Afghanistan, I'd say the Swedish Committee, for example, which just gets on, builds schools, trains teachers, does it quietly. That is happening. Hopefully that will increase when the military leaves, and greater space, greater humanitarian space. Probably time for a couple more. Yeah. Sorry, in the red.
I was just wondering if you had any advice for anyone who's looking to go into journalism after they
Don't do it.
I was scared you might say that.
No. I think it's. People always say that to me actually, and I found it really annoying because clearly it's one of the best jobs in the world. You get to have loads of fun. If that, my daily routine. I never had a daily routine, but such as it was, involved. Some days you'd be up before dawn to go and get the pictures. Other days, it's a bit like not that different to being a student. You can sort of roll out of bed at midday. You're doing something different every day. You're flying on these helicopters. You're climbing these mountains. It's a fantastic job. To get into it, it's worth doing work experience now while you're still at university. It's worth working on your student paper now while you've got one. You've got a good one at Exeter, and then becomes a difficult bit. I wouldn't recommend necessarily straight away going freelance. Partly because you'll need the practice of writing stories, you'll need the practice of meeting editors, you'll need to understand the mechanics of a newspaper. And if you can understand that from a national newspaper, so much the better. So some of the newspapers have graduate training schemes. Graduates are cheap. That's why I was. That's why they hired me. I was a graduate trainee. I think I'm £12,500 a year. Hasn't got much better. Don't do it if you want to be rich. But I'd recommend all of those things. But right now, while you're at university, work experience and student paper. Any more?
What's your most dangerous moment? Or your most
So the one where Corporal David Barnsdale died, that was pretty. Actually, hang on a minute. There are a few contenders. I mean, taking this picture was difficult. I nearly got trampled by a horse. When Corporal David Barnsdale was killed, which was these pictures here, I was about 10 metres away from when the bomb went off. That was terrifying. Although it was one of these things where it was terrifying, but over straight away. And then that fear that lingered with us was the fact that we'd been in this safe area. And it's probably not dissimilar to the size of this room, maybe a little bit bigger, but slightly different shape. And there was a fear that there were more bombs. If they couldn't fight, if they'd missed one, had they missed more? On this trip, this was terrifying because I was in a helicopter. When you're on a foot patrol with any military, if something happens, bad happens, you just get low very quickly. It's instinctive. It's what any of you would do. You can go on hostile environment training courses. You can spend months with the military, but ultimately it's instinctive. You hide, and you sort of copy what the other soldiers are doing. This was terrifying because I was on a helicopter, and the crew, not this guy. He was one of the people we picked up. But the crew, the guy on the right. They only responded to what they call Cat A emergency. So if somebody's got a life-threatening injury, if he doesn't get treatment now, he risks dying. And that invariably means somebody's either been shot or blown up. And if somebody's been shot and blown up, the Taliban know you're coming because they've shot them or blown them up invariably. And they know that a helicopter's coming and they want to shoot a helicopter down. It's a prize for them. It's a huge prize. In fact, they get paid if they do it. They get paid a cash prize by the Taliban commanders in Quetta in Pakistan. And so occasionally you'd be flying along and you'd all be on headsets, although often I couldn't wear the headsets because they just didn't have enough. And so the guys would turn around to me and they'd make this symbol, which would mean we're flying into fire. And that's a moment where it's too late, you can't get off. And you can't, and then you just have no control. And I think that's what I found most terrifying about the helicopters, in this bloody big target with absolutely no control. And for all every time you touch down, you might be landing on another IED. So that was pretty scary. And I think the Ashura bomb was pretty scary as well. And that triggered sort of spontaneous weeping afterwards.
Does that stay with you day to day, like the paranoia? Does it stay with you day to day? So the paranoia that on any given trip something.
No, I mean I feel perfectly safe in here. I was saying earlier, one of the things, like when I tell people it's safe, I encourage people to visit. Kabul's a fantastic place. Afghanistan is a fantastic country. If you get a chance, go and visit it. But what I noticed towards the end is and I walked around, I took local taxis, all of this, I did it all the time. But what I noticed towards the end, if I was walking along and I heard a car coming behind me or in front of me, I'd scan the road for cover and start doing things like this, which I think probably was a sign that there was a level of background stress that was beginning to get unhealthy. And I'm sure I carry it around and I will never forget this guy. I'll never forget the things I've seen like that, the insurer images. I hope I can cope with it. That's a different matter. And I think it's too soon really to tell. I've only been back 2 weeks. Lots of journalists do go on, to become sort of alcoholics or heroin addicts and have failed marriages. So I'm looking forward to all of that. Is that sorry? The last question.
Would you also stay for a longer time after 2014 in Afghanistan and Kabul?
Would I do what?
Stay for a longer time, maybe for 5 years again in Afghanistan.
Would I?
Yeah. After the troops left, after now.
I think I will go back, but I don't know if it'll be for another 5 years. I think I will go back. Yeah. Brilliant.
Sorry, I know. What's still driving the conflict in Afghanistan? Where's the motivation behind it? I know it's not.
What's driving conflict? Okay, very quickly. Massive foreign presence. Pakistan is supporting the insurgency. The Taliban believe that they're defending Islam and trying to repel invaders. All the regional powers have got vested interest. Pakistan wants strategic depth. Iran wants to fight America. Yeah. Slightly oversimplified, but many complex reasons. But ultimately, I think the important takeaway from that is, in my opinion, I think foreign forces have become now as much part of the problem as they are part of the solution. Okay. Thank you very much.